Good morning. If you just signed on, we're just going to wait another minute as folks are joining the meeting before we get started. All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our fourth webinar this week, celebrating the 25th anniversary of Groundwater Awareness Week 2024. During today's webinar, my colleagues will be presenting on the GSP annual reporting process, periodic evaluations, and plan amendments to GSPs. My name is Heather Shannon, and I'm a supervising engineering geologist with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office at DWR. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available online. We've also enabled closed captioning. So if you want to turn those on, you can look at the bottom toolbar and find your captioning options to opt in to use that feature. Today, you'll have an opportunity to engage with our speakers through a Q&A feature. We will have two opportunities for Q&A during those sections. You can type your questions in the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom bar on the screen. If you have questions already typed that you would like to have answered, you can go ahead and, or if you see questions that have already been typed in the Q&A box that you'd like to have answered, you can upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up button that's shown on this screen here. We'll have two speakers today, my colleagues in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office, Andrew Renshaw and Shane Edmonds. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Andrew to get things started.
Thank you, Heather, and thank all you for joining us today during your lunch hour. My name is Andrew Renshaw. I'm joined by Shane Edmonds. The two of us lead the Groundwater Sustainability Plan Review section in SGMO, and today we're here to talk about continued SGMA GSA reporting and showing progress toward implementation. So, next slide, please. I pressed. Anyhow, so the agenda for today. We're going to touch on annual reporting first and kind of dig our heels into the requirements of what is required for annual reporting, and then also the expectations from the department. After that presentation, we'll have a time for a Q&A that's specific to the annual reporting requirements. And then we'll move into a short presentation to briefly outline periodic evaluations and plan amendments. After that, we'll also have another Q&A session to have general questions or questions that are specific to those periodic evaluations and or plan amendments. Next slide. This is all a continuation on the implementation guidance document that we had put out in October. And we hope to hone in on some of the key points and key items in this guidance document and clarify any questions that you all might have. So let's just launch right into it here. Next slide. So what is an annual report? And from our perspective, an annual report is intended to be a compilation and an analysis of data from the basin, from the previous water year, and then a summary of those interpretations of how the GSP is making progress towards implementation. And this little snippet from the guidance document essentially says that, and toward the end, it says that an annual report is really a progress tracking tool. It's a status update, and that's something to keep in mind. And that every year on April 1st, when folks are submitting their annual report, it's a snapshot of what had happened that previous water year, and that story is being told through the analysis of the conditions and analysis of the data that has been acquired, and really looking at what sort of progress has been made toward implementing their plan. Next slide. So what needs to be included in an annual report? There are specific required bits of information and data and figures and maps that the GSP regulations require. Some of those items are, well, all of the items are listed here. The figures to include are a location map, the seasonal high and seasonal low groundwater level contour maps for each principal aquifer, a collection of hydrographs for at least the representative monitoring sites. We suggest that the hydrographs should have the SMC, especially related to groundwater level, chronic lowering groundwater levels, to have those SMC, the measurable objectives and minimum thresholds, displayed on the hydrographs. The regulations also require change in storage maps for each principal aquifer and graphical change in storage figures that depict water year type and groundwater use and that cumulative change in storage. The regulations also require that the annual reports include a collection of data in tabular form, the groundwater extraction by water use sector, groundwater extraction, and the volume measurement methods and accuracy related to that, surface water supply by source type, total water use by source type, and total water use by water use sector. So these are the types, well, these are the data and the figures that are explicitly required to be provided in the annual reporting materials that are sent to the department on April 1st. Next slide, please. And in the guidance document, we provide these very rudimentary tables to indicate that whatever data that is submitted to the Sigma portal through the data submittal process should in fact match what is provided in the annual report through the tabular data in the actual PDF that is uploaded to the portal. So making sure that the data is both correct and accurate in both formats will help streamline not only our review process, but also help all the agencies develop consistency through their annual reporting processes. Next slide, please. So going back to what else is needed in an annual report. Clearly, the maps and the data and the figures are all important, but the GSP regulations also require GSAs to provide detailed descriptions of those maps, of those figures, of the data tables to help convey the groundwater conditions from the previous year. So what does the department expect from you all in terms of describing these data and these maps and these figures in detail? Primarily, we're looking for the methods used to collect and or analyze those data, brief interpretations of the data collected over the water year, including a discussion of how that interpretation of the data is related to the specific water year type from that previous water year. And then also discussion of trends or changes observed when comparing that annual report's data to previous water years. So these can be very concise descriptions that hit on these high notes to help convey what those data and what the figures that we're going to be looking at are telling in terms of the conditions occurring in the basin. Next slide. There's also a second component to annual reporting, and outside that takes that data and the analysis and then translates that into describing the agency's progress towards implementing their plan. And this is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of assessing the groundwater conditions that had occurred in that previous water year, and then what the agency has been doing in response to those conditions. And this is really progress towards implementing projects and management actions over that previous water year, or projecting into the next water year in terms of what the agency expects to be doing. So progress towards implementing the plan, what the department is somewhat kind of expecting or would like to see an annual report in terms of indicating this would be the groundwater conditions in relation to the sustainable management criteria for each applicable sustainability indicator in the basin. So these three bullet points kind of highlight what an annual report could potentially portray in terms of the groundwater conditions. And that is, how do the groundwater conditions compare to the previous water years? Basically, getting back to those trends. Are groundwater conditions trending or on track to meet interim milestones? And were there any minimum threshold exceedances? And if so, interpreting or evaluating why the groundwater conditions have occurred and why those minimum thresholds may have occurred in the basin, rather than trending towards those interim milestones. And then on the flip side of the conditions, it's getting to that idea of what are the agencies actively doing to respond to those conditions. And that's an update on projects and management actions being implemented during the water year or planned to be implemented. So these three bullet points highlight some items that could be included to address that component. And so, did the GSA initiate or continue to implement any projects or management actions? If projects and management actions are planned or not quite implemented yet, why were they not implemented, and when do you expect them to be implemented? And then describe any planned projects or management actions that might be occurring between this particular water year and the future water years and before the periodic evaluation. So it's really a combination of looking at those symptoms, the groundwater conditions, and relating them to the management actions and the projects that are occurring in the basin. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Shane, and he will go over the department's review of annual reports.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. My name is Shane Edmonds. I work in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office with Andrew and Heather. And today I'll be talking about the department's review of annual reports. So Andrew went through a lot of the components that are required to be submitted in annual reports. And a lot of folks have wondered, what is the department going to be looking at? So hopefully through this discussion, we can provide some clarification. And Andrew and I look forward to the question and answer session that will be immediately following the next few slides. So from the department's perspective, we're going to be looking at annual reports in a two-step process. The first thing we're going to be doing is a completeness review. So this is, as it sounds, an evaluation of were the required elements included in the annual report. So Andrew went through the maps, the figures, the water use information, and a description of progress towards plan implementation. Did the agency submit the required information? If the answer is no, our staff may reach out to the agency to get the required information. The second part of our review will be an evaluation towards sustainability. So we want to be constantly looking at, is the basin on track to achieve the sustainability goal? If our staff look at the information in the annual report and have questions, we also may reach out to the agency. Either way, the department will post a letter on the Sigma portal after an annual report is submitted, stating what the results of our review were. whether the review has been finalized and no additional information is required, or a letter describing that additional information is required by the department and outlining what that information is, as well as a timeline and expectations for when that information needs to be submitted to the department. Next slide. And this is something just wanted to build upon, Andrew's slide from earlier. So through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, GSAs will be constantly adaptively managing their basin. So you plan, you do, you adapt, you submit annual reports on your progress, and you also do periodic evaluations. So from the department's perspective, we also want to be constantly looking at what GSAs are doing and evaluating whether they're on track to achieve their sustainability goals or not. And this includes during annual reporting. Next slide. So during the annual report review, some of the things that our staff will be looking at is trying to understand, are impacts to beneficial uses and users occurring? Are there dry wells being reported as an example? Are there public comments being submitted to the agency or public comments being submitted to the department about implementation of a specific plan? Are there impacts to adjacent basins that are occurring? Sometimes we get letters from GSAs commenting on other GSAs implementation of their plans that it may be negatively affecting them. And that's something we'll be taking into consideration. The third one is the agency making progress towards the recommended corrective actions that have been included in their initial plan assessment? So while this is not a required component of the annual report, as GSAs are working to implement their plans and they provide an update towards plan implementation in their annual report, if you're working towards addressing recommended corrective actions, that's going to be important for the department to understand and potentially engage with the agencies as you're working to implement your plan and address any recommended corrective actions. Other things we'll be looking at is the basin in overdraft. Are water levels, rising? Are they falling? Are things getting better? Or are they getting worse? Is the GSA making progress towards achieving sustainability? And that's really what we're going to be looking at on an annual basis, on a continual basis, as the plans are implemented over the 20-year implementation horizon. So we wanted to open it up here. Next slide. For a question and answer session for folks, if they have any questions about the actual components that go into the annual report that Andrew laid out, or any questions about the department's review of annual reports moving forward. And I do want to reiterate that starting with this year, annual reports will be due April 1st. The department will be implementing this process, and we will be providing feedback to the agencies for the first time. So we're gearing up for that, getting ready for the annual reports, have our team ready to go, and look forward to reviewing those reports and providing feedback to the agencies.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions now. So you can go ahead and use that Q&A feature to either type in your questions or to upvote other folks' questions. And we do have one already typed in from John. In addition to posting the letters on the Sigma portal, will the local points of contact receive copies of the letter via email or otherwise?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Andrew. So I think it's up to the local GSA. A lot of GSAs, when something gets posted in the portal, it's automatically emailed to them. If GSAs would like a emailed copy or a mailed copy, that's something we could also facilitate.
Great. Another question from Kyle. It sounds like the department plans to begin this process for the reports submitted April 1st, 2024. Does the department plan to retroactively review plans previously submitted?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kyle. And as you know, and a lot of others on the line know, we've been pretty busy reviewing GSPs for the last couple of years. So we haven't had a lot of time to look at those annual reports. But what we will be doing is looking at them as part of our periodic review. So when an agency submits a periodic evaluation, the department is required to look at annual reports and that periodic evaluation during our periodic review. So yes, we will be looking at all the submitted annual reports as part of that periodic review.
Shane. And from Laurel, will there be any focus on water quality information submitted, as well as public access to information? And then you also got a thanks for your presentation.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah. So the regulations don't require specific water quality data to be submitted to us in terms of the annual report. As part of the monitoring network module that's offered for continued monitoring compliance in SGMA and the GSP regulations, water quality is incorporated into that. However, in the annual report, getting back to the concept of assessing progress towards implementation, that would include, if water quality is a sustainability indicator applicable to the specific basin, they would need to provide an assessment of how their management is in fact improving or leading toward that progress towards sustainability in terms of water quality, as well as any other sustainability indicators relevant in the basin.
And we have some upvoted questions. First is, how long is the annual report review process expected to take? Approximately how long after submission should we expect the letter from DWR?
That's a great question, and I'll give you my best estimate. Don't hold us to this, but we realize that getting feedback to the agencies is important and we need it to be timely. So we're anticipating around 120 annual reports will be submitted to the department this year. We're hoping we can finalize those reviews within 2 months. So by early summer, the agencies should be getting a response from the department.
And building on the previous question from Laurel, we have a question about, will the GSA's annual report be made public to local stakeholders or just the letter of acceptance after it's been reviewed?
Annual reports are posted on the department's SGMA portal, so they are available for public stakeholder access and public comment.
Perfect. In our basin, the progress in our actions and the accumulation of new data do not justify a full periodic review in depth as outlined by DWR. That money would be more useful moving forward on monitoring and governance. Can DWR ask for a lighter periodic review that would cost less?
Yeah, that's a great question, Willie. I'll take a first attempt at answering that, Andrew, and you can weigh in as well. That's one of the reasons that we're trying to do an annual review of this progress towards sustainability, is we want to know what's going on in the basin and be evaluating whether they're on track or not. So a lot of the components we'll be looking at, groundwater levels, looking at implementation of projects and management actions, filling data gaps each year is going to directly inform that periodic review that the department will be doing. And the goal of that is that the periodic evaluation and the periodic review will hopefully become a more simple process as plan implementation continues. So I think that's my key message to the GSAs out there. The more information you put in that section of your annual report, the progress towards sustainability or how you're implementing your plan, it's really going to help the department and help the agency make it clear that they are on track to achieve sustainability, and that should help with that periodic review.
And maybe I'll just try to clarify one thing, if there is a confusion between the annual reporting process versus the periodic review. The periodic review is tied to what we'll discuss next, is the periodic evaluation by the agency, which our review is to occur at least every 5 years. So the process for a periodic review is much more involved and on that 5-year time cycle, where the annual reporting process, as outlined, is really a data submittal process that we will be using to track that progress toward sustainability.
And then following up on that, just a comment from Willie. Thank you, Willie. About just acknowledging DWR's capacity concerns, being overwhelmed by the wave of GSPs and hearing that, pulling off that review of annual reports. So just recognizing that.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's something like 100 or 101 annual reports will be coming in every year. But I will say that our team over the last 4 years has buckled down with the leadership of our office and got through all the initial GSP reviews, and we are really looking forward to moving forward with Sigma implementation and helping you all and helping ourselves, quite frankly, work through these regulatory processes and these reporting processes so that we can, in fact, keep the pedal to the metal on progress towards sustainability.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Atlee, I was going to say, Andrew and other staff at the department are actively working to develop tools to help GSAs with annual reporting, with their periodic evaluation. So we want to help make this process easier for the agencies. To Andrew's point, we want to make it easier for ourselves as well. We want to, be efficient and be learning as we go. So that's something that, we're constantly looking at how we're operating, how we're reviewing things, and how we can be more efficient. So we're committed to doing that, and we anticipate, the more we do it, it's going to become more efficient. And yeah, you're right. We do have limitations with our staff. We have to focus our time and our energy, just like a lot of the GSAs and other folks out there. So we want to work together because we're all working towards the same goal of achieving sustainability across the state.
Thank you both. And if you continue to think of questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat. We will have another Q&A session. At this time, I'm going to launch a poll that's related to some of these questions that have come up and right before our next session. So I'll give you a moment to answer this question about what the biggest challenge for your basin will be when it comes to implementation reporting. Just give you a moment there as we transition, and then I'll pass it over to Andrew.
Alrighty, so the annual reporting is one component of the continued Sigma implementation reporting process. The kind of larger component here that we've alluded to through the periodic review process is this concept of a periodic evaluation. And one of the main drivers, quite honestly, for the guidance document was to somewhat clear the air on some of the terminology out there and really dig our heels into thinking on what is a periodic evaluation. And there's been a lot of commentary on a GSP update or a 5-year update or a periodic update, these sorts of things. And in reality, the regulations, for one, and Sigma don't use those particular terms, but also the periodic evaluation isn't really an update. It really is, in fact, an evaluation of implementation. And what we're looking for, what we're hoping to see is really this act as an implementation evaluation tool. And for our perspective, it's performance assessment. How is the GSA performing in terms of their GSP implementation? And are things working, or are there challenges? And that's what we're trying to trend toward, rather than considering these an update. Next slide, please. There are a number of items that are required in a periodic evaluation per the regulations. There's, I think, 11 specific items that are called out and highlighted in the guidance document. I tried to paraphrase some of those here, where the periodic evaluation is meant to kind of looking back over the last 5 years, what sorts of new information or significant data has been acquired during that time that's really informed the agency on this adaptive management journey, per se, to achieve their goals. And related to that, looking back over the last 5 years in the periodic evaluation, how have the groundwater conditions reacted to those management actions in acquiring the new information, and how do they relate to the sustainable management criteria? And this kind of gets back to that point in the annual reporting process. Are conditions on track to meet interim milestones? Are you on track to meet measurable objectives? Have there been minimum threshold exceedances? Things of that nature. And then again, this status on projects and management actions. Things don't happen overnight. Things don't even happen over the course of one water year. So giving a status update and an evaluation of where projects and management actions are on the periodic evaluation cycle, this 5-year cycle, is going to be very important, and it's going to be critical in terms of assessing those groundwater conditions and what has been actionable in terms of GSA activities. Then also looking at the basin setting. As we're moving forward in Sigma, there's going to be more data gaps. There's going to be data gaps that are filled. There's going to be new monitoring wells, new monitoring locations that are collecting new, maybe improved data, and that needs to be incorporated into the basin setting in terms of understanding the hydrogeologic conceptual model, how that might inform your water budget, and really assessing what might occur in kind of projected groundwater conditions in your basin. Next slide, please. Kind of furthering on the concept of filling data gaps, there's continued improvement of monitoring networks and providing an overall summary of the changes in the monitoring networks over that 5-year cycle, but also discussing what the agency has done to improve on their monitoring and improve their understanding of their basin. And really that's trying to fill data gaps and then identifying other data gaps. And then addressing those and figuring out a path forward to hone in on acquiring that new information that might be informative for implementation. There's also requirements for GSA authorities and enforcement actions. Has the GSA, for example, established or exercised any ordinances that are applicable to the plan? Has there been any sort of authorities granted from the GSA that's being applied to their stakeholders and to their constituents? Things like allocation schemes, are fees being administered? Has a Prop 218 been put out for vote? Those sorts of things would be informative and critical to be conveyed in the periodic evaluation to understand what the GSA as a governing body is doing in terms of managing not only the resource but the constituents in which the basin entails. And on that point, thinking of stakeholders and interested parties, what is the GSA, or what has the GSA been doing in terms of outreach and engagement and coordination with other agencies? And this coordination with other agencies could be other regulatory agencies. A good example of that would be water quality agencies that are already actively regulating components of groundwater quality, but also your neighboring basins. How might the GSA be interacting with that interbasin coordination? But mostly looking at the continued engagement to make sure that interested parties within the basin are actively engaged and understand where the GSA is heading, where they've been, and what sort of adjustments they're making along the way. And then lastly, just a summary of all of the activities that maybe have occurred in the past 5 years, and kind of some summary of where you're at and that kind of progress towards sustainability and how you're moving forward. Next slide. So to build off what Shane had presented in terms of other considerations during annual reporting and what the department will be considering moving forward in implementation, the department's periodic review, which is going to be directly informed by the periodic evaluation and the subsequent annual reports, will also be looking to try to answer these sorts of questions. Where are impacts to beneficial uses and users occurring? Are there impacts to adjacent basins? And what are the implications of that? Have public comments been submitted to the agency or the department, and why that might be? And try to engage with those agencies to understand those interactions. How is the agency addressing the recommended corrective actions that they received in their GSP assessment determination? That's going to be something to be that will be important to include in periodic evaluations to assess whether or not the agency is making progress towards addressing those corrective actions, those recommended corrective actions. And then, as Shane had mentioned, is the basin in overdraft? Are we seeing increased storage, or is there continued decreasing in storage? Similarly to other indicators, however, are we seeing continued degradation of water quality? Are we seeing encroachment of seawater intrusion? Are impacts related to depletions of interconnected surface water present? We will be continuing to assess those indicators and keeping tabs, keeping our finger on the pulse of how the conditions are changing through these periodic evaluations. Next slide. To touch on plan amendments very briefly, I included these two bits from the water code and from the GSP regulations, not necessarily to read them, but more so to highlight that there is very little in terms of explicit requirements when it comes to plan amendments, both in terms of what the GSA may be required to do versus and including what the department may be required to do. So in the basic sense, plan amendments are not required in the GSP regulations or SGMA. An agency may amend their plan at any time and submit that plan to the department, and the department will be on the hook to evaluate that amended plan. One other key component to a plan amendment here is that the plan amendment must also be accompanied by a periodic evaluation. Other components of a plan amendment is an outreach and engagement process must be included, including notification to listed interested parties. There has to be a proper public notice of 90 days and address comments and requests for consultation. And it needs to be adopted by a governing board with proof of adoption being submitted with the adopted plan. Next slide. So, being that the regulations and the Act don't provide that explicit guidance or required information regarding plan amendments, in our implementation guidance document, we try to address this by laying out maybe this concept that if the change that needs to be made in the plan is material enough that you would need to engage your interested parties, or you would need to have a public outreach and engagement process, and or go in front of potentially your board and get board approval on a particular action, that may be considered a plan amendment worthy change. However, being that the department doesn't have, or the GSP regulations don't provide these requirements, it's really up to the discretion of the local agencies in concert with communication with their legal counsel and their boards and their interested parties to understand when a plan amendment needs to occur versus including that information in a periodic evaluation, let's say. So some suggested items that might that you may consider significant or material changes are really related to the changes to the overall management program in the basin. Are changes being made to sustainable management criteria or to the sustainability goal? Or have there been addition or removal of specific management areas that may impact the sustainable management criteria and other sustainability goal criteria like sustainable yield and so on? Have revisions been made to projects and management actions? From initial GSP submittal, we're under no illusion that projects and management actions will be changed. There will be addition of new projects and management actions. There will be removal of some, and whether or not those affect the overall projected water budget, whether the sustainable yield will be affected by the inclusion or the removal of projects and management actions, is something to consider when thinking through whether a plan amendment might need to occur, and how those projects and management actions really will help conditions in the basin move toward that interim milestone, that measurable objective, and ultimately achieve that sustainability goal. And then also lastly, more from the kind of the governance side of things, have there been modifications made to the administrative management of the basin, including addition and removal of GSAs, or the removal of a GSP, or in a kind of an incorporation of one GSP into another, and so on. So these are three high-level items that we wanted to share through the guidance in here that may be considered worthy of a plan amendment pending the local agencies' deliberation with their constituents and with their board and legal counsel and so on. Next slide. That might be it. No. Yeah, here we go. So moving forward, we are, as Shane alluded to, in hope of really trying to help you all while also helping ourselves, in all of us working together to implement Sigma moving forward, and effectively adaptively managing kind of in a collaborative way. We do hope to provide some future resources for reporting that we hope will help one, streamline efforts, but also alleviate some of the stressors that may come with continued reporting. A lot of these future resources will be components added or enhancements to our Sigma portal, such as we are currently in the development of what we're calling a projects and management actions module. This will be a space that all agencies will be able to store and report their PMAs explicitly in the portal in one space, and then that could be tracked year after year, and then also providing data export features like grouping, including hydrographs, so folks can aggregate a collection of hydrographs for a specific basin or specific area, and incorporate those into their analysis and or their annual reports. And then also honing in on the periodic evaluation submittal process. So we've laid out the annual report submittal and kind of review process and expectations, but we hope to do a similar thing with the periodic evaluations. We also hope to continue to build on the guidance document from last year and kind of keep that as a dynamic guidance piece, and potentially in the coming months, probably actually toward the fall, produce a frequently asked question document that's specific to annual reporting. So we encourage all the feedback from you all, and we will incorporate that into our internal conversations, and ultimately hope to put out some further guidance or continued guidance specific to annual reporting to help you all work through this regulatory process as efficiently and smoothly as possible. And I think with that, we're going to move into another Q&A.
And we have a few questions in the Q&A feature. The first is, do changes in sustainable management criteria have to trigger a plan amendment, or can they be handled in the context of a periodic update annual report? And the second part of that is about adopting sustainable management criteria for new monitoring wells.
Maybe I'll address the second question first. Adopting SMC in a new monitoring well, if that SMC, the methodology that is being applied to that SMC hasn't changed, then I wouldn't expect a plan amendment for adopting, well, maybe not adopting, but applying that SMC in a new monitoring location. However, leading into your first question, changes in SMC, depending on kind of that degree of material change and deliberation internally at the local level, may in fact trigger a plan amendment. And something to think about or consider when you are changing SMC is the level of engagement that's going to be necessary for on that interested parties going out and collecting public comment and receiving input from your interested parties on those changes, and then also how those changes to SMC are going to affect the sustainability goal criteria related to water budgeting, including, say, the sustainable yield, and really how that informs then the projects and management actions necessary to achieve those interim milestones and measurable objectives. So things to consider when you're working through changes to SMC.
Great. And then a question from John. Can you please clarify if a periodic evaluation is required to be submitted along with or as part of a plan amendment?
Yeah, I should have mentioned, and it evaded me in the heat of the moment there. The periodic evaluation is in fact required to be submitted with a plan amendment. So our recommendation, and we put this in the guidance, is to the best of the agency's ability to align your amendment with that periodic evaluation 5-year cycle, so that you can effectively kill 2 birds with 1 stone by submitting the amendment with 1 periodic evaluation. However, without getting too complicated here, if a plan amendment was to be submitted before that 5-year time frame, then a periodic evaluation would need to be accompanied with that amendment, and then at that 5-year time step, another periodic evaluation based on what has occurred since that amendment would need to be submitted. So we're encouraging you, to the best of your ability, to align your amendment with your periodic evaluation cycle.
And along those lines, can you confirm what triggers or when the 5-year plan review is triggered? Is it from the submittal of the GSP, the amended GSP, or from the determination point?
The 5-year periodic evaluation and our periodic review is on the initial GSP submit, which that date is located on the SGMA portal where the GSP was originally submitted, but it's also included in the cover letter of the determination from the department.
And just to add to that, Alexandra, so from the department's perspective, the 5-year periodic review, the regulations require for us to do a review at least every 5 years. So what's going on right now, we have some periodic evaluations that were submitted for alternative GSPs in 2022. We had released our initial reviews in 2019, and we will be releasing a final periodic review by July of 2024. So we'll meet that 5-year time frame. So the agencies need to do their periodic evaluation at least every 5 years from their initial plan submittal, as Andrew mentioned, and the department is required to submit our review within 5 years of our determination date. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the requirements will be for the agencies, and then what the requirements will be for the department.
And following up to that, Christina posed a question of why the 5-year clock does not restart with the submission of a periodic evaluation when one is submitted.
Well, I think it's twofold. First, the regulations are pretty clear that, as Shane just highlighted, that the periodic evaluation, our review, is on that 5-year time step associated with the initial plan review. So then building that or extending that out into the implementation period, that we're going to stick with that 5-year time step. The second component to that is maybe a bit more to keep all of us at the department internally on track, is that if we were to allow or to reset the clock at every periodic evaluation submitted outside of that cycle, that 5-year cycle, it would become very unwieldy to try to track and make sure that we are hitting our regulatory responsibilities in terms of deadlines for each basin on that restarted clock. So I think it's a twofold thing. It's one, to maintain the integrity of the regulations, but also to kind of keep our sanity.
And we are running close to time on Q&A, so I'll start with one and see how much time we have. But question from Suzanne: how is a proposed annexation by one GSA of an area that's currently being managed by another GSA within a sub-basin, how would that be handled in a periodic update or annual report?
Yeah, so, and this gets back to those changes that would be occurring kind of at the governance level, in terms of how that might be related to implementation or progress towards sustainability. So in the annual report, that could be included as a discussion related to changes with GSA governance and how those agencies are going to be continue to move forward on their path towards sustainability. How it's handled within a periodic evaluation is similar, providing that level of discussion on why the GSA, the governance changes are occurring, what is happening, and how that affects the management and kind of the implementation, the projects and management actions, what the agency is actively doing in terms of implementing their plan. And if those changes, if the governance changes are substantial enough that they are going to have to cause changes to the management program itself, including SMC or PMAs, that's when there should be an internal dialogue on whether or not a plan amendment is necessary at that 5-year time step.
And just to add to that, Andrew, I did want to say, that sounds like a basic specific question. And, now that the initial plan reviews are done, feel free to reach out to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office if you're weighing those sorts of basin specific questions. We are available outside of this webinar to talk about the issues that are going on in your basin. And it's important for the department to understand the challenges that each GSA is facing as they're implementing their plan. So We've had many examples of GSAs reaching out with questions, and if you have questions or concerns about timelines, amendments, annual reports, periodic evaluations, please reach out and we'd be happy to discuss those further.
And our final question, I'm going to combine two into one. Would a subbasin with an inadequate plan have to submit a periodic evaluation with a plan amendment? And similarly, does addressing corrective actions require a plan amendment?
Yeah, so for the first one, Mark, subbasins that have an inadequate plan that are currently under state intervention processes are not required to submit a periodic evaluation until they are effectively released from state board intervention and come back into the jurisdiction of the department. The inadequate plan basins are in fact required to submit annual reports. That's kind of the process there. And then the corrective actions in a plan amendment, and as much as it pains me to say, it's really up to the discretion of the GSA. I would say in nearly all of our determining, I think all of them, we say something on the order of that we expect the recommended corrective actions to be addressed by the first periodic evaluation. And so indicating that you can, in fact, address those recommended corrective actions in the periodic evaluation. Granted that addressing those recommendations aren't causing those material changes that would require that public outreach, that engagement, the noticing, the adoption from your board. If in fact you determine that those addressing the recommendations require those items, then a plan amendment might be more appropriate. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew and Shane, and to all the participants that joined us today. Also, a big thank you to the Stantec team and the DWR teams working behind the scenes to make this webinar go smoothly. If you have any additional questions that may not have been answered today, please feel free to email us at the sgmps@water.ca.gov email address that was dropped in the chat box. Also, any other questions or feedback you might have regarding this webinar today or any other ones previous that were earlier this week. Don't forget, if you haven't already, to sign up for the Friday webinar. We will be covering a variety of technical assistance and modeling efforts going on within the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. And so please sign up if you haven't. The link is in the chat. And thank you again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.